right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name's Molly, and I will be the moderator for today's chat on what they don't tell you about tech interviews with Fatima Taj. Fatima is a graduate from the University of Waterloo, Canada. Post-graduation, she's worked full-time as a software developer at DRW, a trading firm, and she currently works at Yelp as a software engineer. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Fatima.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Fatima, and I'll be conducting this workshop on what they don't tell you about tech interviews. So as it's already been stated, I currently work as a software engineer at Yelp. And the idea for this inspiration was actually, for this workshop was actually inspired by my move over to Yelp. I joined Yelp roughly like 7 to 8 months ago. And as I was going through the technical interviews myself, I felt that while there's a lot of discussion that happens around technical interviews, most of that discussion just happens to be around like the technical knowledge that you're required to have for a technical interview, right? But through my experience, I felt that there's a lot of other factors at play that really contribute towards your success in a technical interview. And that is what I hope to shed some light on through this workshop. So this is roughly what the workshop is going to look like. We're going to go very chronologically all the way from the very beginning, where you're just starting to shortlist jobs and reach out to recruiters and people within your network, all the way to the very end, where let's say you're trying to decide between multiple offers and you're thinking about things like compensation and negotiation. Okay, so to start off, in the pre-interview stage, I'm not going to delve into any of the prerequisites. So I'm assuming that, your resume is ready to go. You have all that covered. I want to talk about more on the subject of how COVID has impacted the recruiting landscape, right? Because obviously recruiting looks a lot different now. It's not at all what it used to be in the pre-pandemic world. Obviously, in the pre-pandemic world, we were used to in-person interactions with our recruiters. And what that typically looked like was, you would meet your recruiter through either like a tech fair or a conference or a hackathon, and, you go up to them, hand them your resume, and kind of go from there. But obviously now that we don't have the luxury of like in-person interactions, how do you go about networking in this virtual world that we live in now? And I want to talk, that leads me to basically the concept of an elevator pitch. An elevator pitch is essentially this brief introduction that you prepare for yourself. And as the name implies, it should be effective enough to catch someone's attention in the same amount of time as an elevator ride. So ideally, it should be very short and sweet, but effective nonetheless. Now, a couple of tips for your elevator pitch. First of all, please be genuine. I think that if you're genuine, your enthusiasm and passion will really show. And I also say this because keep in mind that recruiters deal with a lot of people on a daily basis. So they're pretty good at figuring out whether or not someone is or isn't being completely honest about either their skill set or their past experiences. Secondly, express genuine interest in the company. Like really sit down and think about why you want to work for a particular company. Is it the engineering culture? Is it the product that really excites you? Is it the culture of innovation, mentorship, whatever it is? I highly encourage you to actually think about this question for a couple of reasons. One, this is a fairly typical question that your recruiter is going to ask you. And again, this is also a question that's bound to come up in even later parts of the interview process. So I think it's just better if you do your due diligence early on in the process as opposed to later on. Secondly, as someone who, I've personally conducted a lot of interviews myself, and you would be surprised to know the number of candidates that come into interviews having not a clue what the company does. And obviously, if you don't know what the company does, you're not going to be able to answer why you want to work for them, right? Or why they interest you. And it just makes you look very disinterested. And obviously, it doesn't reflect positively on you. It just tells me that, I'm just probably another statistic for you. And you're really not interested in this company in particular, right? Now, when I say that, express genuine interest in the company, by no means am I saying that, you need to know what their last quarter's EPS earnings were. But at the very least, go to their website, read up on their mission statement, read up about their values. I can give you like a personal example of how I like to answer this question. So assuming that like I'm applying to like a software engineering posting, I like to talk about like three different things in my response to this question. So for the first part of my response, I talk about the technical appeal. So if I were to join this company, technically, how would they help me improve my skill set as a software engineer? In the second part of my response, I talk about the cultural appeal. So is there something about their culture that I really like and, I want to be a part of? And in the third part of my response, I talk about like particular initiatives that the company might have taken that I like really liked or appreciated. So, for example, when I was interviewing with Yelp, I told them that I really liked the way Yelp responded to small businesses when the pandemic hit. I think this just gives like a more personalized kind of touch to your response, and it also shows your interviewer just the level and the depth of your interest in this particular company. Moving on. So on this slide, you basically see two screenshots, and these are basically just personal messages that I sent out in my most recent job hunt. And the whole motivation behind this slide is to basically demonstrate how you should tailor your approach based on the person it is that you're reaching out to. So the one on the left is just a message that I sent to a recruiter on LinkedIn. I think as far as recruiters are concerned, I think it's perfectly okay if you're just, you just get straight to the point. You don't need to sugarcoat your message. You don't need to beat around the bush. Again, I always like to tell people that be respectful of like a recruiter's time. Obviously, just like yourself, there's likely a lot of other people that are reaching out to the very same recruiter. So like in your messages to a recruiter, be sure to like be very crisp and like make sure that your message is like very well formatted and to the point. Like a rough template that I like to stick to is, quickly introduce yourself, then mention like the exact opening or the exact posting that you're interested in. If you could include a link to it, that's even better. Quickly talk about why you would be a good fit for that opening, and then lastly, always include your resume for the reference. So I think that's like a good template that you can stick to as far as recruiters are concerned. Coming to the screenshot on the right, I do think that as far as people within your network are concerned, so like these includes friends, former colleagues, people that you went to school with, I do think that your approach should be a bit different, because ultimately you share a different sort of relationship with these people. So like, you don't want to make them feel like you're just using them as a means to an end. So don't make the conversation sound too transactional. Like this message, for example, the one on the right, this was a Facebook message that I sent to like a former colleague of mine, and I was hoping that they could refer me for an opportunity that was open at their company. But yeah, I would always suggest that like whenever you're reaching out to people within your network, don't be too direct. I think one of the best ways of kind of going about it is that in your first, like ask them to have like a virtual coffee chat with you, just to kind of break the ice. Try to have and build like a very natural, very organic sort of a relationship with them. Ask them about what they do, what their day-to-day looks like, what they parts of their job that they like, dislike. Try to get an insight into the company culture, the internal workings of the company. And then you can, slowly kind of maneuver the conversation into asking them to refer you. Also keep in mind that these people, like people who already exist within your network, this is the best opportunity that you have to get to know kind of both sides of the coin, right? Like these people will usually be a lot more forthcoming about both the pros and the cons of working at a given company. So again, I think that's something very useful for you to know beforehand. So yeah, something to keep in mind. Another very popular question that I tend to get is just the question of how many jobs you should be applying to. I wish there was like a magical number, but like sadly there isn't. But I do have a couple of tips as far as this is concerned. One, I would really encourage you to harness the power of platforms like LinkedIn, Glassdoor, etc. I personally used both these platforms very successfully. I got an internship off of Glassdoor, and then I got my most recent job off of LinkedIn. Honestly, my most recent job, and I just stuck to LinkedIn. I didn't check Glassdoor too often because I also felt that there's like a lot of overlap between the postings that you see, within all these different platforms. So I think it's perfectly okay if you just stick to either one, whatever you prefer. Secondly, just as far as the process of applying to jobs is concerned, there's no denying that like that's an incredibly boring process, right? Like there's no two ways about that. Like all it is you're kind of sifting through jobs, you're shortlisting them, you're filling out the same fields over and over again, uploading your resume repeatedly. So it can very quickly get very tedious and very overwhelming. So I've kind of experimented with both ends of the spectrum as far as that process is concerned. So I've been the person who used to sit down like every Sunday, go through like thousands and thousands of postings and, kind of apply to jobs in bulk. I personally wouldn't endorse that way of going about it because I think it's a very inefficient use of your time, right? Like obviously when you're going through that many openings, you're not going to be able to finish going through them within an hour. It's likely going to take you a couple of hours. And again, like I said, this process is already like so tedious. You might just like give up and be like, I don't want to do this anymore, right? And again, like when you're going through that many jobs, there's a pretty good probability that you might skip out on a couple of really good ones. So again, I wouldn't endorse this way of going about it. What I did like in my most recent job hunt was that I kind of incorporated this into like a part of my daily routine. So every day I would set aside anywhere between 30 to 45 minutes where I would just apply to jobs, right? Like I would apply the filter that like filters out the jobs for you that were posted within the last 24 hours. Obviously that list isn't going to be as long. I would quickly go through them and I would apply to the ones that I was interested in. I think there's a couple of benefits to going about it this way. One, you time box yourself, right? Like you tell yourself that, okay, this is something that I'm doing every single day, but I'm not going to exceed this 30 to 45-minute mark, right? So one, I think it's like overall, it's just a lot more efficient use of your time. And then secondly, I think it really takes the mental pressure off of this whole process as well. I know that like for a lot of my friends, the part about like looking for a new job that they dread the most is just this part where you're just applying to jobs over and over again. So when you have the assurance that this is something that you're going to be doing every single day, it really takes the mental pressure off of this whole process as well. Okay, so moving on to the actual interview, I'm going to first start off by giving you an overview of what the standard interview structure is, at least as it applies to kind of quote unquote big tech companies. Obviously, this can look a lot different for smaller or medium-sized companies or startups, but you see common elements in all of them. So it starts off with a recruiter reaching out to you with either a phone screen or an online coding challenge. In some cases, you can also get a take-home assignment. Now, I've personally never seen a big tech company kind of give out a take-home assignment. From what I've seen, they like to stick to like, traditional phone screens or like their online coding assessments. But, just so you're aware, I'm personally not a fan of take-home assignments at all. I think like the amount of effort that you put into them is absolutely not worth what you get out of it. But it's part of the process. Then depending on the outcome, there can be a small behavioral round following this. Again, not every company might do this, but this is usually conducted with an engineering manager. And the purpose of this is to assess a cultural fit. And then lastly, you make it to your on-site. This is a standard 4 to 5 hours. It varies a lot by company. It's a combination of technical, behavioral, and system design rounds. There can be anywhere between 2 to 3 technical rounds, 1 system design, and 1 to 2 behavioral rounds. Now, in the pre-pandemic world, obviously the on-site was the part where the company would fly you out to their headquarters and you basically spend an entire day at interviews. But obviously in the virtual world that we live in now, this is also conducted virtually. And like I said, this varies a lot by company. So to give you a couple of examples, some companies can choose to do like hybrid kind of rounds. So those rounds will be a combination of behavioral and technical questions. But then other companies might have like dedicated rounds that are either technical or behavioral in nature. So for example, when I was interviewing with Amazon, their final on-site was 5 rounds in total. Each round was 45 minutes. I would get like a 15-minute break between each round. And for each round, like we would start off and the first 10 to 15 minutes were spent on behavioral questions, and then the rest of the time was spent on technical questions. So yeah, you can see a lot of variation here. Another thing that I wanted to mention was that different companies, again, this is very company dependent, but like different companies might offer you different sorts of accommodations for your final onsite. So for example, when I was interviewing with Twitter, I was actually given the option to either do my onsite in one go, or I could split it across 2 days. So again, like I said, not every company might give you this flexibility, but I think it's something useful to know. And again, this is definitely something that you can bring up to your recruiter if you feel that, if you're very overwhelmed by the prospect of doing your on-site in one go. On the subject of your recruiter is basically your point of contact throughout this entire process. And as you move to the on-site, they'll also set up like a chat with you just to give you an overview of like the logistics of what your on-site will look like. And I highly encourage you to use this opportunity to ask them anything that will put you at ease. So you can ask them things like, when can you expect to hear back after the interview? How will the technical rounds be conducted? Like, what kind of a platform will the interviewer be using? Would it be like something as simple as a Google Doc, or would it be something like HackerRank or CoderPad? Things like that. So you can basically ask them, anything that will put you at ease before your interview. Now, moving to the meat and bones of this workshop, I'm going to start talking about the behavioral parts of the interview first. Now, I actually have like a very interesting kind of a history as far as behavioral interviews are concerned, because for the longest time, I used to really, really underestimate behavioral rounds. And like in my head, I used to think that, oh, this is like the easy part of the technical interview process. And like, it's just a conversation ultimately, right? Like it's just a conversation that you have with your interviewer. So like, why on earth should I like study to have a conversation with someone? It should be like a fairly natural sort of a process. Let me tell you right off the bat that is a very misguided way of going about it, because your behavioral interviews are as important as your technical interviews. They're there for a purpose. They're not like filler rounds. And through your behavioral interviews, your interviewers are basically looking for certain signals from you as the candidate, right? So to begin with, this is a list that I've put together. These are some very typical questions, and the list extends to the next slide as well. These are some just very typical questions that you can expect to be asked in a behavioral interview. These are questions that I've historically been asked, and again, just based off of research that I've done. In terms of your responses to behavioral questions, I do have a couple of tips. First of all, please be honest. Don't fabricate experiences, because you will most likely be caught. Like, it's okay to do like little minor modifications here and there, but I wouldn't advise you to share something that's completely fictitious. And I think, and the reason why I say this is because interviewers always ask follow-up questions. So let's say that, you're asked a question, and in your response, you share something that you just made up, on the spot. Now, what's going to happen is that the interviewer is going to listen to what you had to say, and then they're going to pick at specific elements from, what you just shared, and they're going to ask you about it. So in that follow-up cross-examination that happens, if you hadn't had a chance to really think your response through, the interviewer will figure out that, you're either not being completely honest, or you just weren't well prepared to answer this question. Obviously, you don't want your interviewer to be thinking either of those two things about you. So I think that as far as behavioral interviews are concerned, just always be honest. Secondly, be a good storyteller. And one of the best ways to go about this is to use the STAR format. This is like a very widely used, very popular format within the tech industry. And this is definitely something that you should look up on your own time. Then for each category that I showed you on the previous couple of slides, I would always advise you to prepare at least more than one experience. I know, like, obviously this, like, it can be very overwhelming, right? Like for me, at least, whenever I used to be preparing for my behavioral interviews, the part that I used to kind of dread the most was just like sitting down and thinking about all the experiences that you can talk about, right? But as overwhelming as that might be, I do think that ultimately it ends up serving you pretty well, because you might find that a lot of these questions are being repeated by your interviewers. Like, they might change the wording a bit, but like the central theme of the question might stay the same. So just to avoid sounding like too repetitive, and just to avoid rinsing and repeating the same, story over and over again, I think it's always better if you go into your interviews having thought of like multiple experiences and multiple scenarios that you can share with your interviewers. Next, show what you've learned from your experiences, even if they were failures. Now, I included this bullet point like very specifically because I know that for a lot of people, questions that have to do with like failures that you've experienced or setbacks that you've experienced can feel very daunting. And I know that for a lot of candidates, we tend to think that, oh, these are like meant to be trick questions, and there's not really like a right answer to them. Okay, first of all, I want to clarify that the right response to like tell us what a weakness, share like a weakness of yours is never that, oh, you work too hard. That is absolutely not the correct way to respond to that question. And in fact, I think it actually kind of backfires on you, because it kind of shows that, you don't have humility. But yeah, coming back to what I was saying, the trick to answering these sorts of questions is that you want to show your interviewer what you've learned from your failure, right? So like, I always try to respond to these sorts of questions, keeping like three key components in mind. So one, obviously, I'll start off by sharing my experience. Then I'll talk about what I learned from that experience. And then lastly, I'll wrap it all off by talking about how I changed my ways moving forward from that experience. So I think when you incorporate these three distinct elements to your response, you kind of show the interviewer that you've come full circle, right? Like you've shown the interviewer that, you know, you've actively learned something from this setback that you've experienced, and then, you know, you kind of changed your ways moving forward as well. Because like, think about it, ultimately, what is a failure at the end of the day? Every failure that you experience always presents an opportunity for you to grow from, for you to learn from, right? And that is exactly what they're hoping to see in your response to these sorts of questions. Lastly, if you're asked a question that you don't have an answer to right away, you can always ask your interviewer if you can have 1 to 2 minutes to think about it. I personally wasn't aware that you could do this, but I have done this, and this is perfectly okay. However, I will say that please keep in mind that interview rounds are anywhere between 45 minutes to an hour. So obviously you don't want to be thinking about a question for 5 to 10 minutes at end. Even if you are, your interview will just move you on to the next question. But if you do need like a couple of seconds or like, you know, 1 to 2 minutes to just kind of structure a response in your head, it's perfectly okay for you to take that time. Okay, so moving on to the technical parts of the interview. Like I said, the purpose of this workshop is not to tell you what technical knowledge you should bring into your technical interviews. Like, I'm not here to tell you what algorithms you should know or what data structures you should know. I want to focus more on the optimal strategy that you should have for your technical interviews. So first of all, please keep in mind that questions are kept purposefully vague, and it's your job to clarify, because a big part of technical interviews is that they're looking for your abilities as a software engineer that go just beyond churning out code, right? Obviously, there's a lot of other components to being a good software engineer. For example, one of the abilities that you should have is the ability to do requirements gathering, right? So that includes things like asking good, meaningful, insightful questions. How do you deal with vague specifications in the question prompt? Do you or do you not clarify assumptions? In a technical interview, please keep in mind that you do not have the liberty to make any sorts of assumptions, okay? Even if you're considering making an assumption, please run it by your interviewer. And I would say that like the best way of going about it is to just like quickly make a comment and note it down, right? Because again, like the better documented your code is, it's just a better reflection on you at the end of the day. It's a great testament to your communication abilities as a software engineer as well. Next, write down test cases, specifically corner or edge cases. And I say this very early on because I know that, again, as software engineers, we tend to have this horrible tendency to not think about testing. Either we don't think about testing, or like we try to delay it as much as we can, because like our focus is always like, oh, we just need to get the logic right, and then we'll think about testing. You cannot do that in a technical interview. In an interview setting, even before you start working on your core logic, you need to show your interviewer that you've thought about the corner and edge cases, right? So what you should do is that, again, note down the corner or edge cases, and then quickly work with your interview to see what the expected test outcome should be for these test cases. Because doing this check kind of reinforces whether or not you've understood the question correctly, right? Like, you don't want to be stuck in a situation where you didn't clarify with the interviewer whether or not you had understood the question correctly. You went straight into implementing, the logic, and then 5 minutes left to the interview, and you realize that, oh, I hadn't understood the question correctly, right? Like, you don't want to be stuck in that sort of a situation. So it's always better that, before you dive into any coding, you identify the corner cases, you make a list of them, quickly discuss those with your interviewer, see what the expected test outcome should be, just so you're 100% clear that you've understood the question and all its requirements. Next, communicate effectively, talk things out loud, discuss trade-offs, different strategies that you're considering, etc. Please don't be that person who, within a technical interview, like once you get the question, you just like kind of shrink into your corner, and then you're silent for the next 30 minutes working on the problem. I can assure you that even if you get the problem right, you would not pass that interview, because the interviewer has absolutely no idea and no insight into what your process was, right? Like they can't tell what's going on in your obviously in your mind, right? And that is exactly the point of a technical interview. They want to see your approach towards technical problems, and they don't know that. They don't have any insight to that if you're just silent throughout the process, right? I can tell you again, personally, I've been in a lot of interviews where I might not have gotten like the 100% optimal solution. I was maybe like anywhere between 60 to 80% there, but just because I was communicating very well throughout the entire process, I was discussing things with my interviewer. I was discussing different trade-offs, different strategies that I was considering. Not only was I able to pass those interview rounds, but I actually got great feedback about them as well. So please keep this in mind. Communication is very, very integral to your success in a technical interview. If you're stuck, again, you can ask for help, but I'll say that there's like a caveat to this, right? And the caveat is that you can ask for help provided that you've been communicating well up to this point, right? Like if you've been silent for the past 20 minutes, you can't just expect your interviewer to know what you're stuck on or what you're struggling with. In fact, I'll say that the other one of the biggest perks of effective communication is that if the interviewer feels that you're going too off track, they'll actually stop you, right there. They'll cut you off and they'll kind of nudge you into the right direction. So overall, it also saves you potentially a lot of time, and time is of the essence in a technical interview. Okay, so not every interviewer will allow you to compile your code and see if the test cases pass. Now, this kind of goes back to the point earlier that I was making about the importance of testing. Now, I'm sure that we've all been in a situation where, let's say, you're working on this very challenging legal problem, and you're almost there, but like you still have a couple of test cases that are failing. So what you do is that you make a little change in your code, and then you hit the run button again. You still have a couple of test cases that are failing. So what you do is that you get into this loop of like making a change, hitting the run button, making a change, hitting the run button, until eventually, you either get to the right solution or you give up, right? Now, I call this the abuse of the run button, and you cannot, under any circumstances, do this within a technical interview, because it tells your interviewer two things about you. One, it tells them that you don't have the debugging abilities to figure out what the problem with your logic is. And then secondly, it tells them that you rely on automated testing to tell you what the problem is, right? So referring back to the optimal strategy that I was talking about that you should have for your technical interviews, once you get the question, you're going to take your time to read the question. You're going to ask good, meaningful, insightful questions. You're going to clarify any vague specifications in the question prompt, and you're going to clarify any assumptions that you're going to base your solution off of, right? And again, the more well-documented your code is, the better it is. Then you're going to identify corner or edge cases. Again, you're going to note those down. You're going to quickly work with your interviewer to see what the expected test outcome should be for these test cases, because again, this is a great testament to whether or not you understood the question correctly. Only now will you delve into the actual code, right? Once you're done working on your code, before you hit any sort of run or submit button, you're going to do this exercise where, using the code, the test cases that you identified earlier, you're going to step through your code line by line. And I'm not exaggerating that. I actually mean line by line. Now, right now, it might feel that like, oh, that should be like fairly simple, right? I can assure you that like it's actually not. Like stepping through your code line by line is actually pretty challenging, because when I say line by line, you're basically seeing how, like line after line, how the different variables are being updated, right? And especially in an interview setting, it can be pretty challenging. So I would actually advise you that like even in your own personal time when you're doing legal problems, try to do that. Try to step through your code line by line just to see what that process is like. Now, when you do this exercise, it shows your interviewer a couple of things. One, it shows them that you actually have the skill to step through your code. And then secondly, it shows them that, okay, this person has like reasonable assurance that their piece of code is going to work as expected, right? So at the very least, please don't forget to do this exercise. Even after having done this exercise, if there's like minor errors here and there, that's perfectly okay. That's very normal. But at the very least, you need to do this exercise to show your interviewer that you have reasonable assurance that your logic is going to work as expected. Now, moving on to the system design rounds, I actually don't delve too deep into system design rounds for this in this workshop, because I think honestly, like system design rounds are like a completely different beast altogether. I could have like a completely separate workshop just dedicated to how they work and, you know, things that you should watch out for as far as they're concerned. But like the only thing that I'll say right now is that for your system design rounds, it's very important to have like, it's very important that you have like a visual component to your responses. So like it's very important to draw diagrams or class diagrams if the question is about object-oriented design. And this is because a big component of system design interviews is that the interviewer wants to see your understanding of how different components in the system are interconnected. Lastly, if you're nervous about your technical interviews, I would really advise you to watch like real life technical interview videos. This is something that I did, and honestly, it was a lifesaver. One, like for a couple of reasons. One, it just kind of put me at ease, right? Because I think when we go into these interviews, a big reason that we're so scared is it's just fear of the unknown, right? Like we don't know what's gonna happen. We don't know, like we know the format, you know, and all of that, but like we haven't really experienced it. So for me at least, a big reason that I used to be so scared was that it was just fear of the unknown. I just didn't know what I was kind of getting into. Secondly, I think that at this point, technical interviews definitely have a reputation within the industry. Like, right? Like they're supposedly so scary and so overwhelming and like so intimidating. Like every time I go on LinkedIn, there's like 20 different people talking about like their different experiences. And obviously everyone has a different experience, right? And then lastly, I think that as candidates, when we go into these interviews, we go in expecting perfection from ourselves. And we think that if we're anything less than perfect, we're not going to get that coveted offer, right? And that could not be further from the truth, because no one expects perfection from you in a technical interview or any interview for that matter, right? Because at the end of the day, an interview is an interaction between two human beings. So like by the very nature of that, there's bound to be issues or little mistakes that you make here and there. And most of these mistakes are like very forgivable mistakes. So like, for example, a lot of people stutter when they're nervous. I do that. It's perfectly okay to do that. It's okay to be stuck. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay not to have the right answer right away. So I think watching these videos is just kind of, it just kind of humanized this whole process for me, right? And it helped me realize that like a lot of these mistakes that we think that, oh, this is going to like be like an immediate deal breaker. A lot of these mistakes are pretty forgivable human mistakes for you to make. Okay, so we're almost at the end of the presentation. This is kind of like the last part. So in the post-interview part, I want to give you like a quick overview of what happens behind the scenes once we're done our interviews, because I think that again, as candidates, we tend to assume the worst, right? Like if we're not hearing back immediately after an interview, we tend to think that, oh, we've probably been rejected and we didn't do well. And that might not necessarily be true. So basically what happens is that once you're done your interview, your recruiter basically puts together this package for you that includes your resume, any code samples that you submitted throughout the entire interview process, and then feedback from all the interviewers that met you. And then this package is then sent over to the hiring committee, which makes the final decisions as to whether or not an offer is going to be extended to a candidate. Now, the frequency at which hiring committees meet can look very different based on the company. So I've interviewed with companies where the hiring committees would meet as often as 3 times a week. So, with those sorts of companies, the turnaround time is going to be very quick. You're likely going to hear back about the results of your interviews within like 1 to 2 days, right? But obviously, like I said, the frequency can look very different based on the company. So that's why there might be like a considerable gap between once you finish your interviews and then once, you hear back about the results of your interviews. This is a very, very oversimplified high-level view of how hiring committees work. If you're interested, definitely go look this up on your own time. It's very fascinating to just kind of learn more about them. Google, for example, is very famous for how their hiring committees work. Then obviously, as far as hearing back from your recruiter is concerned, I think there's a couple of things that obviously we should keep in mind. One, obviously, no candidate ever wants to hear back, and ever wants their recruiter to tell them that they've been rejected. But I think even in cases of rejection, I think there's much better professional ways of going about it. Please don't be that person who just reads the rejection email and then off to the junk folder, out of sight, out of mind. I think at the very least, please thank your recruiter. You have to realize that your recruiter is someone who's with you from from the very start all the way to the very end. So thank them for their time. If company policy allows, you can ask them for feedback. Now, bigger tech companies actually have explicit policies against giving feedback, so they'll just straight up tell you that we don't share feedback. But smaller companies are usually pretty okay. I personally asked 2 of the companies that I interviewed with for feedback, and they were perfectly okay sharing that. And honestly, that feedback is just invaluable, right? Please be respectful of other companies that you might have interviews scheduled with in case you've accepted an offer. Please don't ghost anyone. Be respectful of their time and respectfully let them know of your decision. And I say that, in my opinion, I think irrespective of whatever the outcome of your interview is, it's always better never to shut the door completely on a given company. Unless you saw some explicit red flags in your interviews with them, I think it's always better to propose staying connected for future opportunities, because this way not only does your network continue to grow, but the next time that you're in the job market, you have some solid places to start from. And just to kind of give you an example, this is an email that I sent out to a company that I was no longer interested in interviewing with, just to kind of demonstrate this post-interview etiquette that I was talking about earlier. Okay, so I promise, this is the actual last and final part of my presentation. This is something that I'm very, very passionate about. I love talking about negotiation for a couple of reasons. One, this was something that I didn't do for my first full-time offer out of school, and I regretted it so bad for the next 2 years of working at that company. And ironically enough, I actually knew about the importance of negotiation throughout my undergrad. But somehow when I got to that time, I kind of chickened out. I got so conscious of myself. I felt so underconfident and so unsure of what I was bringing to the table that would justify asking for a higher salary, that I decided not to try to negotiate, which was a horrible decision on my part. Secondly, I think there's a huge lack of awareness about as far as negotiation is concerned, right? I know that there's so many people out there who are not even aware that you should and you can negotiate your offer. And lastly, I think there's also a lot of awkwardness that surrounds this conversation, right? And I'll get to that later. But to start off, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what typical compensation packages in tech are like, because they can have multiple components to them. So there's a base salary, which is usually, this is pretty standard, obviously, and this is usually the most difficult to negotiate. Then there's your restricted stock units, or your RSUs. Now, with your RSUs, you need to understand the vesting schedule. So typically, companies follow a 4-year vesting schedule. And what that means is that each year, 25% of your RSUs will vest, okay? Your RSUs are only kind of monetarily worth anything to you once they have vested. So let's say that tomorrow you sign a contract with a company and they grant you 100K worth of RSUs. They haven't vested yet, so technically they don't really mean anything to you right now. They're equivalent to $0 to you right now. However, after your first 1-year anniversary of working at that company, 25% of your RSUs will vest, and at this point, they're just company shares. So you can basically do whatever you want with them. You can choose to sell them at the time, or keep them, sell them at a later time. It's all up to you. But yeah, with your RSUs, you have to be mindful of the vesting schedule. Then there's a yearly bonus. Again, I think this is pretty standard. It's a set percentage of your base salary, and this is prorated. So what that means is that if you worked for a company for half a year, your yearly bonus would be half of what it would have been if you had worked there the entire year. And lastly, there's a signing bonus, and this is usually where you have the most room to negotiate. Please do keep in mind that your signing bonus is a one-time thing. You only get it in your first year. So if you're calculating what you're going to be making after the first year, it will be your base, your yearly bonus, and then your RSUs that vest that year. As far as research about compensation numbers is concerned, obviously talk to your friends if they're comfortable sharing their packages. I always think that it's better to talk to friends across a wide variety of industries because I think it just gives you a much better idea what the market might be willing to offer you. So, talk to a friend who's working as a software engineer at, say, like a bank versus, say, a hedge fund versus like, a big tech company. As far as resources online are concerned, I actually wouldn't recommend Glassdoor in this case because it can be pretty unreliable. I would recommend something like levels.fyi. I personally used it and I highly, highly recommend it for a couple of reasons. One, it breaks down the salaries for you into these different components that we talked about. Then it also shows you how salaries differ based on location. So keep in mind that you could be working for the exact same company in the exact same team, but you could be making something very different if you're, say, based in San Francisco versus Toronto versus, say, London. So Levels offers you that sort of a transparency as well. And lastly, it also shows you how salaries differ across like different engineering levels. So overall, I'd say a highly, highly recommended resource. Okay, so moving to the actual negotiation. So please never accept an offer as soon as it's presented. This is called negotiation 101. Your recruiter will likely call you to discuss the compensation package. At this time, just jot down the details, thank them, and ask them for how long you have to accept the offer. And this is usually because a lot of offers in tech are called exploding offers, and that's because you usually don't have a lot of time to accept the offer, like usually like a week or maybe 10 days. So I think it's always better to have like a tentative timeline in mind. Then I got a lot of advice in terms of like how I should go about negotiating. So whether it should be like via a phone call or an email. Ultimately, I think obviously it depends on like what you're more comfortable with. I personally thought that I wouldn't do so well over a phone call, so I decided to email my recruiter instead. In your follow-up conversation, always thank them for extending the offer to you. And at this point, you should have concrete numbers ready and mention any competing offers or deadlines. However, please never lie to a recruiter about competing offers or compensation because, one, they're very well connected. And then secondly, they can also ask you to submit proof of competing offers or compensation. So, don't do anything to jeopardize the offer at this stage. And lastly, recruiters really like it if you convey that you'll be ready to sign the contract immediately if they can get to your proposed numbers. And just to kind of demonstrate this, I've included the email that I sent out when I was trying to negotiate. So you're absolutely free to use this email template if you want. Going back to what I was saying earlier about how awkward this conversation sometimes can be, these 5 lines that you see here, it took me 30 minutes to come up with these 5 lines. And I was still so unsure of myself that like I forwarded this to like 5 of my friends to proofread. And only once they had given me the green light did I eventually forward this to my recruiter. So for sure, this conversation can feel very awkward for a lot of people. But yeah, that brings me to the end of this workshop. I think we made it in like good time. If you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them right now. Otherwise, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn or you can email me. But yeah, thank you so much for coming to listen to me today.
Really fantastic, Fatima. Thank you so much. Actually, there were a lot of great questions in the chat. So if y'all hang on for just a little bit, we'll answer some of those. So one of the first ones that was mentioned was, do you have any tips for what to say if a recruiter asks why you left a previous employer?
I don't think I've been asked that, but I do know that like people usually advise not to kind of badmouth your previous company. Other than that, I think I actually saw this question in a chat somewhere. I can look it up, but yeah, I think like for now I'll just say that don't say anything that will don't say anything that makes you sound like you're kind of bad mouthing your previous employer. But otherwise I think you can like saying something like I've been asked that, oh, why are you looking for another opportunity? And to that I like to say that it's because I wanna have I'm interested in like this new domain that I want to explore, or I'm looking to be in a role with kind of more responsibility, things like that. So that's how I've typically answered this sort of a question, and that usually goes okay. But yeah, I don't know if that was an adequate enough.
Absolutely. I think that's a great answer. I think I've been in a similar position where I'm like, looking to continue growing, to continue building. If anyone has mentioned anything like that. Would you recommend tailoring your resume specifically to the job role description, or kind of keep a separate generic resume? And some people asked in particular to this, like especially in some of those entry-level positions.
I will say that I think that's always a good idea. So like, you know how like people have this concept of like having like a master resume and then you can have like tailored versions. So I do like that idea. Usually what I do for myself is that like I just have this Word doc where I keep dumping things that I'm doing. And then when it comes to like updating my resume, I just refer to that Word doc, and I'll add the details that I think are relevant to a given opportunity. But I think having like this master resume or like a document where you're just you're adding everything that you're doing, because like honestly we like over time you do a lot, and then when it comes to updating your resume you might not be able to kind of think back to all the things that you've done. So I think having like this doc where you're just adding every single thing that you're doing is always very helpful. And then I think that makes tailoring your resume a lot easier when the time comes.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. What would you suggest for people in terms of practicing, for an interview? I know you mentioned, possibly watching interviews. Do you think that practicing a mock interview, maybe with someone in your area, would be beneficial?
For sure. Yeah. Definitely very beneficial. One, obviously it's very good for the nerves, right? So you can get like sort of like a close idea of what the actual interview is kind of going to look like. For sure. I think mock interviews are a great way of going about it, especially for, I think, behavioral questions. I think for technical ones, yeah, like, we have a lot of resources, you can, obviously there's the lead code way of going about it or whatnot, but I think definitely for behavioral questions, I've personally met a lot of people. I think something that I've noticed in terms of candidates as far as behavioral questions are concerned is that people really tend to overestimate how well they're doing as far as behavioral questions are concerned. Like you might think that, oh, my answer was fantastic, but it might not, and there might be some like really big red flags in there. So I think more so for behavioral questions, I think it's always better if you can just run your responses by a couple of people. And I would actually say the same for the technical parts as well, because like I said, like when I talked about like the optimal strategy that you should have, and lead code is not going to test your strategy, right? Like lead code doesn't know whether you're a good communicator. So all those little things, to bridge all those little gaps in between, I think it's always beneficial to do a couple of mock interviews.
In some interviews, are they going to be looking for you to solve algorithms in tech interviews for web developers, or is that going to be something that's specific to software engineer positions?
That's a bit hard to say. Honestly, it depends on the company, on who your interviewer is. Yeah, especially honestly, if it's smaller or like medium-sized companies, especially if they don't have like a set interview process in place, honestly, you don't really know what they're going to kind of throw at you, which is why, again, I said that before going into your interviews, like if there's an HR person or like you have like a proper recruiter, always ask them, just so like you have an idea of what to expect. Like, and like I've personally never been in a situation where a recruiter has been like, oh, I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen. Like we're going to keep it a secret. So like they're always very, obviously they want you to succeed, right? Like this is something that like people should keep in mind, is that they want you to succeed. What's funny is that I obviously, as a student, you never get an insight into what recruiting looks like. But then once I got into recruiting myself, I realized how time consuming it is for companies. And I think that's something that we really tend not to think about. Recruiting is very expensive, very exhausting, and just very time consuming for companies. They want to find the perfect candidate and they want to do it fast. So like HR, whatever recruiter you have, they're there to help you succeed. So like always ask them before going into an interview what to expect. But yeah, as far as the question is concerned, there can be a lot of variation. So just make sure to clarify that before you head in.
Yeah, absolutely. From the perspective of someone that has done some hiring, would you say, it's still good practice to negotiate a salary when you are in a junior developer role or looking at an entry level position?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, you should even negotiate for your internships. Like I've personally helped my younger brother negotiate two of his internships very successfully. So like I went to the University of Waterloo, and Waterloo has like so they have like co-op as part of our degree. So basically we do X number of internships as part of our degree. And like this was drilled into us even at like the internship level. There's no discrimination, like there's no rule anywhere that says that you can only negotiate for your full-time offers. In fact, I think that the earlier you get started, the better it is. Negotiation is a skill at the end of the day. It's not something that you're magically going to know how to do just because you're considering a full-time offer. So I think like the earlier you get started, the better it is. So don't ever let that stop you. Also, please keep in mind that the absolute worst thing that can happen if you try to negotiate is that the company will say no. That's it. Like they won't retract your offer just because you're trying to negotiate a higher salary. So don't ever let that fear stop you from trying to negotiate.
How did you pick, the companies you wanted to interview with? Did you pick larger or smaller companies? Were you interested in specific types of technology? What made you decide where you interviewed?
So for me, it was a couple of factors. One, I was looking for a very, very solid engineering culture. And I had heard great things about Yelp's engineering culture. Even honestly, when I was in as an undergrad, Yelp used to hire very, very heavily from Waterloo. So like I was kind of aware that, they have like a very good kind of reputation. So one, the engineering culture was a big consideration for me. Secondly, yes, I was looking to go to like a slightly bigger company. I felt that like I wasn't right now. I felt that where I was in terms of like as a software engineer, I felt that I wasn't just yet ready for like the giants. But I was like, and earlier I was working at kind of like a small to mid-sized company. So I was like, okay, I'm looking for some like a sweet spot in the middle. So that was another consideration. And then lastly, I just wanted like to be at a place where, which has like a really conducive work culture. So again, like I had heard great things about Yelp's culture overall. I had a lot of friends who worked there personally and they all had great things to say. So for myself, where I felt I was as a software engineer in terms of like the growth that I was envisioning for myself, the pace that I wanted to go at, I thought that Yelp was hitting all the, it was checking off all the boxes. So yeah, that's how I decided.
Well, I know there were tons of questions in this chat. Thank you so much, Fatima, for all the information that you shared. And thank you everyone for attending this session, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you for having me. Take care.